Trawling through the notes and findings of my many years this morning, I came across this little ditty from many years ago now. It was during the time I studied theatre way back in 1988-89. What fun that was. Although primitive in its construction and imagination, it reflected the sort of diverse comedy I felt needed pursuing at the time. This last reiterates previous comments I've made about early influences having a profound impact on the evolution of creativeness. This small snippet is just a tip of a small iceberg, so to speak, that I have found, though it does not give off a does give off a taster of the Arctic Tuna to come, should this go down well. Not only does it exemplify my distaste for the office lifestyle very early in my writing career, it also reminds me, even the casual observer, of 5 Cambridge, Oxford chaps whose rep well precedes them. Periguinus' Herring Cycling Funfair, Part 1. Health, Sickness and Safety. A gridlocked M20 always proliferates propaganda and stress, not least when there is a massive haulage vehicle on your lane. This phenomenon can be classified and quantified as the Get the Hell Off the Road syndrome, or GTHOTRS for short. A bit of pocket fluff hummed patiently to himself, observing the dented rear of the huge lorry shake disconcertingly as he did so. There was some sort of thin, insubstantial yellow liquid dripping out of the bottom of the truck. He couldn't quite discern exactly the substance was coming from, but it had been making a trail of nastiness for 5 miles now. A sort of Arctic burst ate into the concrete of the road, and he was getting rather concerned. "Yeah, darling, I'll be right back around 8. Bit off cradle the phone in the cleft of his first shoulder as he steered the clanking Citron. "No, I'll get it on now, and I'll use it when I get there. I told you," he continued. It's not gone off, it's just the display date." The short, middle-aged man leaned forward to get a closer look at the lorry. He managed to find a small leeway to get round the vehicle and glanced at the side of its huge carriage. "Black's not so good as it was 30 years ago, classic European lager," it said in bold letters. He frowned. The interior was not much more inspiring either. The back part of the storage area contained copious barrels of lager, whilst the front held a large conference table on which sat a dozen brewery executives. "Now," the managing director, Seymour Clements, leans earnestly forward in his plushy reclining executive chair, cobwebs and dust proliferating from the furniture around him at an alarming rate. "As the meeting is drawing to an end, has anyone got anything else they'd like to add to the notices on the agenda?" Alex Hemline, the executive in charge of a good deal more than he was given credit for, piped up. "We haven't actually discussed anything yet, sir," he whispered in Clemens' ear beside him. "Right," Seymour continued, patting his jacket for the notes he'd made on the minutes from the last meeting. "Oh, blast!" he further exclaimed wildly, patting and foraying in his pockets, shoes and finally boxers in disbelief. "Who's got the minutes from the last meeting?" All 12 of the suits around him threw their arms in abdication of guilt. "Oh, mother of my second wife aunt once removed," he exclaimed, and pressed the intercom before him, brushing his manicured nails against the side of his desk as he did so. "Mr. Pocket Fluff?" he begun. "Yes, sir. Whoa there!" As he spoke, the bus Pocket Fluff was driving jolted slightly, sending 3 or more files to the floor. "Pocket Fluff!" Clemens exclaimed in desperate exasperation when he eventually let go of the table he was holding onto for dear life. "Sorry, sir." Pocket Fluff nervously laughed. "Just narrowly missed a polar bear running across the motorway." The others around the table nodded in recognition as Clemens shrugged off and continued. "Have you seen the meeting agenda for last week?" "No, sir. I'm afraid not. Sorry." "That's quite all right, Pocket Fluff." He sighed desperately, switching the intercom off for a minute, and then leaned forward again, switching the intercom back on. "And be more careful with the driving in future." "Absolutely, sir." The crumpled old man moved slowly towards the others. So, he pressed accusingly, who has it? The others moaned, only partially recognised Seymour's questions as they picked themselves up from the wooden flooring of the truck. Sorry, sir, Malcolm grunted as he pulled himself off the secretary he had accidentally fallen onto. Just a quick stumble. I noticed, exclaimed Mary Bernard as she got up and brushed herself down. I'll just go and make some coffees now, gentlemen. A sparkling lighter could be heard as she made her way through the barrels of lager to the back of the truck. Various wisps of smoke rose from the barrels of not so good as it was 30 years ago brew. Sorry, sir. As I was going to say, Malcolm coughed as the smoke reached him. I think I might be able to help here. Well, Grote, what is it, man? Clements drew in a breath. Malcolm shuffled his papers in desperation, recognising his culpability to think of something quick, whilst avoiding his boss's eyes. It's like this, sir. I did take the papers home with me. What? Seymour rose from his rising place in abhorrence of his employee's behaviour. Grote shuffled nervously in apprehensive anticipation of the wrath he was going to get, though partly looking forward to it. He hadn't had a good bit of wrath in ages. His feet scraped and scruffed the floor unnoticeably as he shuffled audibly. Well, the beige pinstripe executive grabbed for an excuse which couldn't be found and ended up in a lap of confusion. Malcolm! George Confusion cried in a squeaky voice. What the hell do you think you're doing, man? Sorry, George. He pulled himself back up to a position of minimal pride and strengthened his suit and tie. To continue my inadequate explanation, sir? Malcolm continued his inadequate explanation. I was slightly fuzzy over the details of the last meeting, so I took the liberty of borrowing the papers and taking them home to read after dinner. Go on, Malcolm. I'm interested in hearing your reason for defying and betraying my trust. Seymour beckoned, leaning slightly forward over the table whilst holding his back. He felt a slight crick developing. It was by this time that Clements realised he had leaned such a way over the boardroom table so many times he was beginning to look slightly absurd instead of imposing. He quickly, though not too quickly, surreptitiously would be a better epithet to use, moved to a more dignified and upright position. Well, sir, Grote continued, it was just after supper. He rose from the chair and began to stroll up and down the floor in an official manner, putting his hands behind his back between waving his limbs about in a theatrical fashion, and I moved to sit on the sofa I had just bought. The other suited men around the table groaned with an air of those who had long experience of exercising regular tolerance of the man. Oh my God, fellows, Confusion beheld, throwing his hands into the air. He's off again. George looked at his boss. With all due respect, sir, do you see what you've done now? He despairs. The doctor told us to be careful of his condition. Well, it wasn't my fault. I thought he'd got over it. Grove continued unabated. As my wife took the children to bed, I started to study the key points of the text. He swiveled round on his heels, reaching the far end of the moving vehicle. Moving behind his superior, he sat in the senior executive's chair. He moved down slowly to place a hand on Clemence's shoulder as he whispered in his ear. The man's eyes widened. It was then, sir, that I heard a cry from my daughter's bedroom. Seymour shook him away. That's all very well, Grote, he said with emotion, but where are the notes? I'm getting to that, sir. Malcolm started pacing again. Moving in alarm to respond to the distress in my household, I put the documents down and went to assist my wife. No wonder his Mrs. polishing great stone from accounts, George whispered surreptitiously to Frank Woodholding, who was sitting with a contented glee next to him. As I moved the stairway, my wife came rushing towards me, declaring it was all her fault. The minutes, Grote. Clements pressed Malcolm impatiently. Where are the bloody minutes? Grote ignored this and glanced sympathetically at his boss for his lack of patience. He then continued unabated, turning towards the lager barrels who started to strut. I then asked her the reason for her unfathomable behaviour. She then proceeded to tell me that her daughter had just thrown up all over the new laid carpet, that she had to clean it up. By this point, Clement had despaired of ever getting an answer to his simple question and was revelling in the stupidity of ever asking. Clemens now had his head shaking from side to side and his forehead resting on the papers in front of him, and the sudden jolt of the truck alerted the board to sit up in their seats. Seymour slowly raised his head and stroked a new bruise in his noggin. He stared at the intercom. "A bit of?" Seymour accusingly inquired of Pocket Fluff, who was meant to be driving. "What in the name of my auntie's pet goat was that?" "Sorry, sir," Pocket Fluff shouted through the little speakers on the desk. "The M20 is full of Arctic animals today. It's weird." He explained away in his peculiar accent, which seemed to smack of the higher gentry. "The ice caps haven't completely melted yet." He considered for a moment. "It isn't even a bank holiday either. It must have been scared by something." "Why are you shouting a bit of?" Clemens asked curiously. "The cab you're in is meant to be a soundproof environment." "I apologize, sir," he answered in a monotone. "My friend persuaded me to go clubbing on the weekend, and it's been like that ever since." "How old are you, man?" You should be around 70. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." Clements pressed the button and held a breath, exasperated that everyone seemed to be apologizing to him today. "May I continue, sir?" Grote asked, sitting on a barrel. "If you must," Seymour sighed. "Right." He bounced off the barrel, falling onto the floor. "Damn, I've got a splinter now." "Will you get on with it?" "Very well, sir." Malcolm rubbed the inside of his hand. "As I was saying, I'd found out from my missus that my second daughter was ill. When I wrapped my head around what Sarah, my wife, had told me, she gave me a bag of my daughter's sick. She was a bit pissed that she had to put up with all that while I was here." "What did you say to that?" George Confucian asked, most passionately. "Too much to drink, and tuna, I think." Malcolm looked steadily at George. "Mind you, you should know about that being the head of marketing." George sat back and was silent. "Anyway," Malcolm explained, twiddling his pen as he sat down and stretched, "I didn't get a chance to reply. She just threw the bag down the sofa and it burst, with exploding nastiness all over the place. I had to sleep on it." "Ah, sorry, mate," Alex Henline commiserated, "but we have to know where those notes are now." He paused and took a more official stance. "As a head of marketing, it is my job to remind you that you are extremely naughty to have behaved the way you have." He moved the biscuits away from the tea trolley. "You're not having any of them this afternoon. Now, where are the minutes?" They were under the bag of puke when it exploded on the sofa," Grote admitted. A loud smashing of silence echoed across the table as the truck took another swerve, throwing the group out of their chairs again. "Oh, this is bad." Clement's word ricocheted around the truck as he staggered up. "This is very bad, gentlemen," he said loudly. "I have no pleasure in saying Mr. Grote has committed an offence which cannot be tolerated." "It's only a few notes, sir." Alex rubbed Seymour's arm, trying to placate him. "I refer not to the notes," Seymour announced, "but to the unfathomable and heinous act." He sat down slowly and solemnly. "Mr. Malcolm Grote ate some fresh food at his supper table." "I did ask my wife to put it in a nasty little cardboard box and soak it in synthetic preservatives for the night," Grote excused, wide-eyed and desperate for understanding and forgiveness. "That, I'm afraid, Malcolm, is not good enough." Seymour sunk his head in shame and regret for the company's reputation and standing. "And I put in direct sunlight the next day after that." Malcolm was now frantically grasping at straws to save his job. Seymour shook his head sadly. "I didn't even put it into the fridge once." He was becoming hysterical. Seymour looked directly at him, sternly and softly announcing, "Malcolm, because of my personal regard for your long-standing service to this firm, and seeing that this is only the 10th time you have transgressed the small bureaucratic fine print of your contract with us, I am compelled to give you one last chance if you can reassure me on one point." Seymour looked inquisitively and inquired, "What was the contents of this?" He turned his lip up in disgust. "Fresh food." Grote bowed in shame, deep-seated guilt, he admitted. "It was a Greek salad, sir." Seymour gradually stood up, taking his thick-rimmed spectacles from the tip of his nose as he placed them on the briefcase in front of him. "Malcolm, this is the most outrageous thing I have heard from a member of this wholesale outlet," he sneered. I fear with this revelation there is nothing I can do to save you now. Pocket Fluff, he cried out to the driver of the truck, who was dutifully appeared by his side. Take Mr. Grote outside and deposit him on the adjacent truck of disgrace. No, not the truck of disgrace, sir. Please, no, Grote desperately cried out, rather unconvincingly, as he was dragged and thrust towards the open slidey door of the truck. You will be demoted after your long period of solitude to simply executive in charge of importing terrible Indian lager. Seymour yelled after him, regally declaring his position. That's not very fair, sir. Pocket Fluff looked at him, somewhat dismayed at this treatment of Malcolm Grote. There's hardly enough room for more polar bears on the truck of disgrace as it is. Life isn't fair a bit of. Clements glanced with disdain and concern at his subordinate. For a moment things would be running alongside each other, totally in sync and harmony, and then suddenly everything's out of joint. Pocket Fluff considered this, looking at the wooden floor in deep concentration, pulling at the fabrics of postulation in his head. He said, popping his head up towards Seymour in a sudden burst of inspiration. Well, sometimes things just stop suddenly, and for no reason, like a little...